The wind rolled across the valley that evening like a whisper from another world, carrying dust and loneliness from miles of open land. A single cabin stood on the far edge of the prairie, its roof patched with tin, its porch boards creaking under the weight of silence. Inside, the dim glow of a lantern flickered against the rough pine walls, lighting a face both nervous and soft. A woman's face. A newcomer to the frontier, her dress plain, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered kindling near the stove. The old townsfolk had called her brave for settling this far out, but some had whispered another word too. Foolish. Out here, the nights were long, the wolves closer, and the only neighbor within half a day's ride was a man who didn't speak much anymore. A blind cowboy rancher who lived alone on the ridge above the dry riverbed. They said he'd once been the best horsebreaker in the territory, a man who could calm even the wildest stallion with just his voice. Then one summer, a Mustang kicked him hard, shattering bone and sight alike. Since then, he'd lived in the dark, his world reduced to sound and scent and memory. He still rode sometimes, guided by an old mare that knew every inch of the hills, but he didn't come to town anymore. Some said the accident had broken more than his sight. Others said it had made him dangerous. The woman had heard all those stories before she came. Still, she'd written a letter to him weeks earlier asking for help, not out of pity but out of desperation. Her husband had died in a wagon accident that left her with a small piece of land and no means to work it. The soil was rough, the fences down, and winter would not wait for grief. So she asked the blind cowboy to teach her the land, to show her how to plant, how to mend, how to survive. She hadn't expected a reply, but one morning she found a folded note tied to her gatepost with twine. In rough handwriting it said, "If you can ride, meet me by the river before sundown." That message had stayed with her for days, written deeper into her heart than she cared to admit. It wasn't just help she needed, it was courage. Something in that short line had felt like a promise, a chance to be seen in a world that no longer saw her. Now, as the sun sank behind the buttes, she stood at the edge of the riverbank, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The water glimmered faintly under the fading sky. She could hear the distant rhythm of hooves. Slow, steady, sure. A dark horse emerged from the shadows, its rider sitting tall even though his eyes were hidden beneath a wide hat. He didn't speak right away. He just reined in beside her, turning his head slightly, as if searching for her face through the sound of her breath. "You came," he said quietly, his voice rough but deep, the kind that seemed carved by the land itself. She nodded, though she realized he couldn't see it. "Yes, sir. I did." He tilted his head. "You don't sound like you're from around here." "I'm not," she answered softly. "But I mean to learn." The horse shifted under him and the leather creaked. "It's hard country for a woman alone," he said. "I know," she replied, her voice steadier now. "That's why I asked you." There was a long pause. The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust. Then he dismounted slowly, one hand on the saddle, the other brushing against the horse's flank. When his boots met the earth, she noticed how sure his movements were despite his blindness. He walked toward her, each step deliberate, his head slightly turned as if following her heartbeat instead of her outline. "I'll teach you what I can," he said finally, stopping a few paces away. "But I don't work with charity. You'll work, and you'll learn, and you'll keep up." "I didn't come for pity," she said, lifting her chin. "I came for a chance." He nodded faintly, the faintest trace of approval in the way his jaw tightened. "Then you'll start tomorrow. Bring gloves." For a moment they stood there in silence, neither willing to step back nor step closer. The air between them seemed alive, heavy with something neither of them wanted to name. When he turned to mount again, his hand brushed hers by accident. The contact was brief, but it sent something through her chest that made her catch her breath. He froze too, as if the touch had reminded him of a life he'd long buried under dust and silence. "I'm sorry," she murmured. He shook his head slowly. "Don't be, just be careful." That night, back in her cabin, she couldn't sleep. The sound of his voice kept replaying in her mind, rough and patient, like the low hum of the prairie wind. She wasn't sure what frightened her more, the loneliness that had followed her all her life, or the strange comfort she'd felt when standing near him. By dawn, she was at his ranch. The land stretched wide around it, acres of dry grass, wooden fences, and horses that moved like shadows under the pale light. He was already at work, guiding his hands over a saddle he was mending. She hesitated near the fence until he spoke without looking up. "You walk like someone carrying too much worry," he said. "Set it down before you come closer." She managed a nervous smile. "I suppose I've been carrying that a while. Then it's time to learn how to leave it behind," he replied. He showed her how to tie ropes, how to listen to the wind before a storm, how to judge a horse's temper by the sound of its breath. He never raised his voice, never rushed. Yet she found herself trembling each time his hand brushed hers when correcting a knot or guiding her grip. His blindness made his presence even more intense. He seemed to feel everything, every motion, every pause, every heartbeat near him. As the days passed, something unspoken grew between them. She saw how he lived, alone but proud, refusing help yet offering it freely when asked. He had a quiet dignity that came from years of pain, and though he couldn't see her face, she often felt as though he saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. One evening, after a long day repairing fences, a storm rolled over the plains. They took shelter in his barn, the sound of rain pounding against the roof. The air was cool and thick with the scent of hay and damp earth. Lightning flashed briefly through the cracks in the wood and she flinched. He turned his head toward her, sensing her fear. "You all right?" he asked softly. She nodded, then whispered, "I'm just not used to storms like this." He moved closer, careful, his hand resting on the beam beside her shoulder. "You'll get used to it. The land tests everyone, teaches patience, teaches trust." Her heart was beating fast, her voice barely a breath. "I've never done any of this before, never lived this way, never worked this hard." She hesitated, her words trembling. "Please go slow. This is my first time." For a long moment there was only the sound of rain and the steady rhythm of his breath. Then quietly, he said, "I'll be careful. You'll learn." The lantern flickered between them, shadows sliding across his face, strong, worn, and distant. He reached out slowly, finding her hand and guiding it to the rope they'd been working with earlier. "Feel the tension," he said. "Don't pull too hard. The trick is to listen to it, not fight it." She followed his instruction, her fingers trembling as his guided hers. The rope tightened perfectly, and he smiled faintly. "There," he murmured. "You did it." Outside, thunder rolled across the open valley, echoing through the barn. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. For the first time, he didn't feel lost. But as the storm deepened, neither of them knew that someone else was watching from the ridge, a figure on horseback, half hidden by rain, whose presence would soon shatter the fragile peace of their two broken worlds. The sound of hooves faded into the night, and the wind carried the scent of something colder than rain, the scent of trouble approaching. The morning after the storm, the sky over the valley was washed clean, pale blue stretching from one end of the prairie to the other. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings, though something in it still carried a chill. The woman rose early, her body sore from the long hours of work, her hands marked with faint blisters from the rope. She looked toward the ridge where the blind cowboy's ranch sat, a thin line of smoke rising from his chimney. She had promised to meet him again that day, and though she was tired, she found herself eager to see him, to hear his voice, the quiet calm that steadied her when the silence of the land became too loud. She saddled her mule and rode through the damp fields. The world felt different now, more alive, more dangerous, as if every sound hid a secret. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the echo drifted across the hills. When she reached the barn, he was already outside, sitting on a wooden bench with a mug of coffee in his hand. His hat was tilted forward, his expression unreadable behind the scars time had etched into his face. "You ride quiet," he said without lifting his head. "You must have grown up somewhere with soft roads." "I grew up near the coast," she replied, dismounting. "Never thought I'd end up this far inland." He smiled faintly. "The land has a way of pulling in those who need it most." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched him, the way his head tilted slightly as if listening to the grass move, the way his hands rested on the mug as though he could feel the shape of the morning through the warmth of the cup. There was something in his stillness that both comforted and unsettled her. It was as if he carried his pain like a shadow that refused to leave, quiet but always present. He stood after a moment, setting the cup aside. "Fence line near the creek is down," he said. "We'll fix it before noon. After that, you can help feed the horses. I'll show you which ones to keep your distance from." She nodded, falling into step beside him. The ground was soft from the rain, and the smell of wet sage filled the air. As they worked, she began to notice the small ways he managed without sight. How he'd pause, listening before moving. How he counted steps and remembered every turn of the land by the sound of the wind. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight, like they'd been thought through a dozen times before leaving his mouth. As the day wore on, she began to relax, forgetting for a while that the world had once been cruel to both of them. Yet every now and then, he'd pause mid-task, his head turning sharply toward the ridge, as though he sensed something she couldn't see. When she asked what was wrong, he'd only shake his head and mutter, "Just the wind," but she wasn't so sure. Later that afternoon, when they returned to the barn, she found something odd, a set of fresh hoof prints near the fence. The soil was still damp, the prints clear and deep from a heavy horse shod with worn iron shoes. She crouched beside them, her brow furrowed. "Did someone ride through here last night?" she asked. He turned his head toward her, his jaw tightening. "No one should have." "There are tracks right here," she said. "Big ones." He walked toward her slowly, his hand brushing along the fence post until his boots reached the spot. He bent down, touched the ground lightly, and frowned. "You're right. Those ain't mine." Her stomach twisted. Could they belong to a ranch hand? "I don't keep any," he said. "Haven't for years." The silence that followed was heavy. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint creak of the old windmill and the restless cry of a crow overhead. Something unseen had been near, maybe still was. She could see it on his face. Even though he couldn't see, he felt it deeply, as if the world whispered warnings only he could hear. "Maybe it's nothing," she said quietly. He straightened, his hand still resting on the post. Nothing doesn't leave marks this deep. That night, after they finished the day's work, she lingered longer than usual. The light was fading, the sky streaked with gold and violet. She helped him tie up the horses, her heart heavy with thoughts she couldn't voice. He was alone in this wide land, and though he'd never said it, she knew he didn't trust people easily. Something about the tracks had unsettled him, but he wouldn't admit it. "You should head home before dark," he said finally. "I will," she replied, though she didn't move. "Do you ever get used to it? The quiet?" He smiled faintly. "You don't get used to it. You just stop fighting it." When she left, he stood by the barn door, listening to her footsteps fade into the open field. Only when the last sound was gone did he reach into his coat pocket and pull out a small object, a tarnished silver button, one she hadn't seen him find. He turned it in his fingers, tracing its pattern. It wasn't his, and it hadn't been there yesterday. Down the trail, she felt the unease too. The land seemed darker somehow, the shadows longer. Every rustle of grass made her heart jump. When she finally reached her cabin, she bolted the door and sat near the window, watching the moon rise over the ridge. For a long time nothing moved, until a flicker of light caught her eye. A campfire, small and distant, somewhere near his ranch. Sleep wouldn't come easily that night. The rain had washed away her fears for a time, but now they returned with the cold. She thought of the man she'd met, his calm voice, his strength, the way he listened to the world. Something inside her ached for him, though she didn't understand why. Maybe it was because he carried his wounds with grace, or maybe it was because he made her feel less invisible. At dawn, she returned to his ranch. The fire she'd seen in the night was gone, leaving no trace. He was already awake, feeding the horses. His face looked more drawn, his jaw set like he hadn't slept either. "Did you see that light last night?" she asked carefully. "I can't see," he said flatly, then softened his tone. "But I felt it. Heard something too. A horse breathing where there shouldn't be one." She hesitated. "Do you think someone's watching you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the hills, listening. "I think the past doesn't like to stay buried out here." She wanted to ask what he meant, but his expression silenced her. They worked through the morning, fixing the corral and moving hay, yet his unease hung heavy in the air. Each sound, a creak, a gust, a hoofbeat, made him pause. By noon she couldn't stand the tension any longer. "You've lived alone for years," she said. "Why stay here if it brings you no peace?" He set his tools down slowly. "Because this is the only place that still remembers who I was. And because leaving means admitting I can't face what happened here." "What did happen?" she asked softly. He drew a long breath. "A man I trusted once tried to take everything from me. My land, my sight, my life. Folks said he died after that. I never believed it." Her heart pounded. "You think he's back?" "I think some ghosts don't rest easy," he murmured. They stood in silence again, the wind carrying the faint cry of an eagle overhead. The open land seemed endless and empty, yet every corner of it now felt alive with hidden danger. She wanted to reach out to touch his arm, to tell him he wasn't alone anymore, but she didn't. Something told her this man's pain ran too deep for comfort, at least for now. As the sun set, he saddled his horse. "Go home before dark," he said. "Lock your door. And if you hear anything tonight, don't open it," she frowned. "You're not coming back with me?" He shook his head. "There's something I need to find out first." She wanted to argue, but one look at his face stopped her. He might have been blind, but his resolve was iron. She watched him ride into the fading light, his figure melting into the shadows of the hills. Back at her cabin, she did as he said, locked the door, doused the lamp, and sat by the window. The land outside was quiet again, too quiet. Somewhere far off a horse neighed, followed by the distant echo of a gunshot. Then silence returned, heavy and absolute. Her breath caught. She stood by the window, staring into the darkness but saw nothing, only the long stretch of prairie silver under the moon. Still, she felt it, something shifting out there, something drawing closer. The night dragged on. Hours passed. Then, just before dawn, she heard the slow, familiar rhythm of hooves stopping outside her cabin. She froze, her heart thudding painfully. "Is that you?" she called through the door. There was no answer, only the creak of a saddle and the faint jingle of a spur. Her hand went to the rifle by the hearth, but she hesitated. Then came the sound. A quiet knock, deliberate and slow, and from the other side, a voice she barely recognized whispered, "Open the door, please." It was his voice, hoarse, strained, but unmistakable. Yet something in its tone felt wrong, too calm, too cold. The woman's breath trembled in her throat as she stepped closer, her hand still hovering near the rifle, torn between fear and trust, unsure whether the man who had taught her courage still stood on the other side, or if someone else wore his voice in the dark. The door stood between her and the voice that had once brought her comfort, and now that same voice filled her with dread. The woman's hand trembled on the wooden latch, her mind torn between what she heard and what her heart feared. The knock came again, softer this time, almost pleading. "It's me," he said, but there was a break in the words, something faintly off, like the sound of a man forcing calm when he was not calm at all. She took a slow breath and stepped back from the door. "If it's really you," she said quietly, "tell me what I said to you the night of the storm." There was a pause, long and sharp. She could hear the horse shifting outside, the leather reins creaking. Then the answer came, not the one she hoped for. "You said you weren't afraid anymore." Her heart tightened. That wasn't what she had said. She had said, "Please go slow. This is my first time." Whoever stood out there didn't know that or didn't remember. She gripped the rifle tighter, her pulse racing. "You should leave," she whispered. The silence that followed was heavy. Then came the sound of boots in the dirt, fading slowly as the rider turned away. She waited, frozen, until the hoofbeats disappeared into the distance. Only then did she breathe again. The night remained thick and cold, and though dawn crept across the horizon, it brought no comfort. When the first rays of light filled the cabin, she opened the door. The yard was empty except for a single print in the mud, the deep mark of a horse's hoof, and beside it, the faint impression of a boot dragging slightly. She knew the blind cowboy's stride was steady. He wouldn't drag his foot like that. Someone else had come, someone pretending to be him. She saddled her mule at once and rode toward the ridge. The land was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made the heart pound harder. As she climbed the slope, the air grew cooler, and the wind carried a faint metallic scent, something between dust and blood. When she reached his ranch, she saw smoke curling faintly from the chimney, and relief mixed with fear. He was alive. She found him in the barn, kneeling beside a wounded horse. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He turned his head slightly when he heard her footsteps. "You shouldn't be here," he said. She knelt beside him. "Someone came to my cabin last night pretending to be you." His expression didn't change, but his jaw tensed. "Describe him." "I didn't see his face." "He never showed it, but he knew your voice." He was silent for a long while, his hand resting on the horse's neck as it breathed weakly. "He's back," he said finally. "The man I told you about, the one I thought was gone." Her stomach twisted. "The one who tried to kill you?" He nodded once. "He was my foreman years ago. Knew every inch of this land, every trail and fence post. When I was blinded, I thought that would be the end of it. But maybe he's been waiting all along. Watching." She looked toward the open field beyond the barn. The hills stretched endlessly, but now they seemed to close in around them, trapping both of them in an invisible circle of danger. "Why come back now?" she whispered. "Because he thinks I'm weak," the cowboy said. "Blind, alone, easy to finish." He stood, wincing from the strain in his leg, and reached for the saddle hanging on the wall. "I need to find him before he finds me again." "You can't go after him like this," she protested. "You'll be riding into his trap." He turned his face toward her, his blind eyes clouded but fierce. "I've lived in the dark long enough to know what's around me. He'll expect me to hide. I won't." She wanted to stop him, but she could see there was no changing his mind. His pride was stronger than fear, and though he couldn't see the path ahead, he rode as if guided by instinct older than sight. She followed him despite his protests, keeping a short distance behind. The prairie stretched out before them, endless and quiet, with only the wind to bear witness to the two figures moving through it. The blind cowboy on his dark horse, and the woman who refused to let him face it alone. They rode for miles until they reached the edge of a dried creek bed. The ground was littered with broken branches and scattered boot prints. He dismounted, crouching low, his fingers tracing the dirt. "2 horses," he murmured. "One heavy, one light. Been here last night." She looked around, uneasy. "He's watching us, isn't he?" "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe he wants us to think he is." As they searched the area, she noticed something half buried under the sand. A small metal trinket, a worn silver ring engraved with a single letter, D. She handed it to him. He ran his fingers over it and his face hardened. "It's his," he said quietly. "He used to wear this when he worked my land." The sun was lowering again, painting the plains gold. They found no trace beyond that, only silence and the distant howl of coyotes. They returned to the ranch as dusk fell. Neither spoke much, but the air between them had changed. The woman saw how the cowboy carried his pain, not as weakness but as proof he was still alive. And in her heart, she began to fear not only for him, but for herself, because somewhere between the fear and the work, she had grown to care for him deeply. That night, she stayed at the ranch. The wind had grown stronger, rattling the shutters and stirring the lantern flame. He sat by the fire, his expression distant. "You should leave before dawn," he said. "It's not safe here anymore." "I'm not leaving," she said simply. "You can't fight this alone." He turned toward her, the shadows deepening across his face. "You don't understand what kind of man he is. He doesn't just take what he wants, he breaks it first." "I've been broken before," she said softly. "I survived it." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. He said nothing more, but his hand clenched around the edge of his chair. In that moment she saw how much he struggled, not just against his enemy, but against the memory of the man he once was before blindness took the light from his world. As the hours passed, she heard the sound of movement outside again, faint at first, then clearer. A creak of wood, the scrape of a boot. She rose quietly, motioning for him to stay still. He tilted his head, listening, and then whispered, "Barn roof." "He's there." She moved toward the window, her breath shallow. In the pale moonlight, she saw a shadow crossing the roof, tall, deliberate, and armed. Whoever it was, they weren't running this time. They were waiting. She turned to him. "What do we do?" He reached for the rifle leaning beside the hearth, checking the chamber with practiced hands. "We wait for him to make the first mistake." The next moment stretched into eternity. The shadow shifted again, the sound of footsteps moving along the roof beams. The wind howled, shaking the window. Then, silence. Suddenly, the lantern flame flickered out and darkness swallowed the room. She gasped softly. He moved closer, his hand brushing her arm, steady and calm. "Stay quiet," he whispered. A heartbeat later, the door creaked open. The intruder stepped inside, a man with a scar running across his cheek and a revolver in his hand. His voice was cold, familiar only to the cowboy. "You've got a good memory, old friend," he said. "Didn't think you'd still be waiting for me." The blind cowboy stood slowly, facing him. "I don't forget betrayal." The intruder laughed low. "You can't even see me. What are you gonna do? Shoot the dark?" The woman's pulse thundered in her ears. The air was thick with danger, but the cowboy didn't move. His voice was quiet but firm. "You made one mistake." "And what's that?" The intruder sneered. "You came back." Before the man could react, the woman stepped forward, raising the rifle. The shot exploded through the cabin, deafening in the small space. The intruder staggered back, but the bullet missed, grazing his arm. He cursed, fired wildly, and the cowboy dove for cover, dragging her down behind the table. The room filled with smoke and echoes of violence. When the gunfire stopped, the intruder was gone, vanished into the night. Only the door swung open, and the wind howled through the empty doorway. They sat there in the dark, both breathing hard. The cowboy's hand found hers, steady despite the chaos. "You did good," he murmured. "You're braver than you think." She wanted to believe him, but her heart was still racing. The image of the man's cold eyes burned into her mind. "He's not done, is he?" she asked quietly. "No," he said, his tone grim. This was just a warning. The fire was out, the walls scarred with bullet holes, and outside the prairie stretched into endless darkness. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a man with a scar and a grudge waited, planning his next move. And inside the cabin, two souls, one blind, one afraid, found themselves bound not by fate but by the simple, terrifying truth that they were all each other had left in a land that never forgave weakness. The night grew cold again, and though dawn would come, neither of them would sleep. The morning after the gunfight, the air around the ranch was still heavy with the smell of gunpowder. The cabin's wooden walls bore the marks of the night's violence, small holes and splinters where bullets had torn through. Smoke hung in the corners, faint but stubborn, as though the memory of that moment refused to leave. The woman swept the broken glass from the floor while the blind cowboy sat by the door, his hand resting on his knee, silent. Neither had slept. Neither had spoken much since the man vanished into the dark. When the light crept over the valley, painting everything in the gray of dawn, she finally broke the silence. "He'll come back," she said softly. "I know," the cowboy replied, his voice low. "He never leaves anything unfinished." She paused, glancing toward the open window where the wind pushed through the curtain. "Then what are we going to do?" He didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly as if listening to the air itself. "We wait," he said finally. "And we make him think we're afraid," she frowned. "You mean we pretend?" He nodded. "A man like him feeds on fear. He'll move faster if he thinks he's already won." His words carried the weight of someone who'd lived with danger for too long. There was no panic in his tone, just a cold steadiness that made her heart ache. Still, she saw the exhaustion in his face, the strain of years spent fighting ghosts, both real and remembered. They worked through the day fortifying the place. She helped him nail planks over the weaker spots of the walls while he strung a set of bells near the back entrance, a trick he'd learned from the old Apache trails he once rode. Every sound now meant something. Every creak, every gust, every rattle of loose tin could be a warning. By late afternoon, the air had grown dry again, and the sun burned low on the horizon. He sat on the porch, cleaning his revolver by touch alone. She brought him water and sat beside him. "Tell me about him," she said quietly. "The man who wants you dead." He didn't look at her, his fingers working the gun with slow precision. "His name was Dyer," he said. "He came out here after the war. Tough man, mean when he wanted to be. I hired him to help break horses. He was good at it, too good. But he wanted more. When I wouldn't sell him half my land, he started stealing. A few cattle at first, then a mare, then money from the safe. When I caught him, he tried to make it look like an accident. A horse kicked me while he was behind it. Broke my skull, took my sight. I thought he'd left me for dead." Her breath caught. "And you never saw him again?" "Not until last night." They sat in silence after that. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and golden, but it no longer looked peaceful. Somewhere out there, Dyer was waiting, watching for the moment to strike again. The woman felt her courage trembling beneath the weight of it all, yet she also felt something else, the pull of loyalty. This man, broken and scarred, had taught her to survive. Now she couldn't imagine walking away. As dusk settled, a windstorm began to rise, sweeping dust across the valley. The horizon disappeared behind a brown haze. The horses in the corral grew restless, stamping and snorting as the wind howled louder. The cowboy stood, listening. "He'll use the storm," he said. "It'll cover his approach." She looked around, panic rising in her chest. "Then we have to hide." He shook his head. "No, we hold our ground." The storm grew fierce. The sky turned dark and thunder rolled far away. She lit a lantern, its glow flickering wildly against the cabin walls. Outside, the world vanished into swirling dust. Then faintly through the wind came a sound, the slow, uneven rhythm of hoofbeats. She froze. "He's here." The cowboy's jaw tightened. "Get to the corner." "Stay low." The hoofbeats stopped near the barn. Silence followed, broken only by the wind whipping through the grass. Then the creak of a door, slow, deliberate. Someone was moving inside the barn. The cowboy reached for his rifle, his head tilted slightly. "He's checking the horses. Trying to draw us out." She crouched near the window, peering through the narrow crack between the boards. She saw the faint shadow of a man, tall, broad, moving like he belonged to the darkness. He carried a lantern now, its light cutting through the dust. He looked calm, methodical. She could almost see the smirk on his face. "He's not scared of us," she whispered. "Not yet," the cowboy said. The next few minutes stretched on endlessly. The sound of metal clinking came from outside, Dyer tightening a saddle or maybe checking his weapon. Then, without warning, the barn door slammed shut. The horses screamed. The woman jumped, gripping her rifle. "What's he doing?" "Burning us out," the cowboy said grimly. "He'll set fire to the barn, wait for the flames to spread, then pick us off when we run." Her heart raced. She rushed toward the door, but he caught her wrist. "Don't," he said firmly. "That's what he wants. But the horses—" "I'll get them out," he said, already moving toward the back. "When I say go, you cover me." The storm raged harder, the air thick with dust and heat. The smell of smoke reached them, faint at first, then stronger. The barn was burning. She could see the orange glow flickering through the gaps in the walls. "Now," he said. He stepped into the wind, his body steady despite his blindness. She followed, shielding her face as smoke and dust swirled around them. He moved with uncanny precision, counting steps, feeling the ground with his boots. At the barn door, he kicked it open and led the terrified horses out one by one, his voice low and steady as he guided them through the chaos. Dyer's voice came from the shadows. "Still playing the hero, huh?" The cowboy turned toward the sound, his gun raised. "You never were much for honest work?" Dyer laughed, cold and sharp. "You took everything from me. This land should have been mine. You don't deserve it." "You tried to steal it," the cowboy replied. "You're no better now than you were then." "Maybe," Dyer said, his tone darkening. "But at least I can still see." The words cut deep. The cowboy's hand trembled slightly, but he didn't fire. The woman stood behind him, watching, torn between fear and fury. Dyer stepped forward, the lantern light glinting off the metal of his revolver. "Tell you what," Dyer said. "I'll make it quick this time." The cowboy's voice was calm. "You've said that before." Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by a crash of thunder that shook the ground. The wind tore through the burning barn, spreading the flames faster. Sparks flew around them, the smoke choking the air. In that blinding moment, the woman saw Dyer raise his gun. She didn't think, she fired. The shot rang out, echoing across the valley. Dyer dropped to one knee, his hat flying off as the bullet grazed his head. He fired back, the bullet slamming into the wooden post beside her. The cowboy moved forward, placing himself between her and the gunfire. "Get inside!" he shouted. "I won't leave you. Now." She hesitated, then ran for cover as Dyer stumbled back into the shadows. The storm howled louder, the flames consuming what was left of the barn. The cowboy moved slowly, listening, waiting. Every sound was a clue, the scrape of boots, the hiss of fire, the rhythm of Dyer's breath somewhere behind him. Dyer spoke again, his voice rough with anger. "You can't see me. You're already dead, old man." The cowboy tilted his head. "You talk too much." He fired, one clean shot into the dark. The sound was deafening, then silence. For a long moment nothing moved. The wind eased and the fire crackled. The woman stepped out of the cabin, her eyes scanning the smoke-filled yard. She saw the cowboy standing there, his rifle lowered, his shoulders rising and falling with each breath. "Did you get him?" she asked. He didn't answer. He turned his head slightly, listening. Then he said quietly, "No, he's still out there." Her heart sank. The firelight flickered across his face, casting long shadows over his eyes. The storm began to fade, but the tension did not. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Dyer was alive, wounded, angry, and waiting for another chance. The cowboy wiped the sweat from his brow. "He won't stop until one of us is gone." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Then you're not facing him alone." He turned his face toward her, his blind eyes soft but determined. "You don't understand what that means." "Yes, I do," she said. "He already took your sight. I won't let him take your soul too." The wind carried their words away into the night. Behind them, the barn collapsed with a groan, sparks rising into the dark sky. The land smelled of ash and sorrow. The cowboy reached out, his hand finding hers, holding it tight. In the distance, a single horse neighed, faint but distinct. Both of them froze. The sound came again, closer this time. Dyer wasn't gone. He was coming back. The woman's heart pounded as the cowboy raised his rifle once more. The land fell silent, waiting for the final reckoning that was now only moments away. The horse's cry echoed through the dark valley, and the woman's breath caught in her chest. The sound grew clearer, deliberate, closing the distance between them. She gripped the cowboy's arm, her pulse racing, but he stood unmoving, his head turned toward the noise. The faint jingle of spurs followed, slow, steady, like a man walking toward his fate without fear. The wind had died down now, leaving the world eerily still, the smell of smoke from the burned barn hanging heavy in the air. The land felt smaller, as though everything in the sky, the dirt, the years of pain, had drawn in to witness what was coming. The cowboy raised his rifle. "He's here," he murmured. His voice was calm, too calm, the way a man sounds when he's already accepted whatever comes next. The woman wanted to beg him to leave, to run, but she knew he wouldn't. Dyer had taken his sight, his peace, maybe even his will to live for a while, but he wouldn't take his dignity, not now. From the mist that still lingered near the corral, a figure emerged. Dyer rode slowly, slumped slightly in the saddle, his arm bound with a strip of cloth dark with blood. Even wounded, he carried that same cruel confidence in his posture, that same sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. He stopped a few yards from them, dismounted, and let his horse wander off into the open field. His revolver hung low at his side. "I've come to finish this," Dyer said, his voice hoarse but hard. "No more tricks. No more hiding." The cowboy didn't move. "Then finish it." The woman stood between them before either could act. "Stop this!" she cried. "There's been enough pain. You'll kill each other, and for what? For land that'll dry up and turn to dust like the rest of this place?" Neither man answered. The cowboy's jaw tightened. Dyer's eyes flicked toward her like she was a ghost standing in the wrong story. "You should stay out of this, lady," Dyer said coldly. "You don't know what he did." "I know what you both lost," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "You lost your sight. He lost his mercy. This land's already taken enough from both of you. Don't give it any more." For a moment, something almost human flickered across Dyer's face. A memory, maybe guilt. But it passed as quickly as it came. "He took my life when he turned me in," Dyer said. "They branded me a thief, ran me out of every town west of the river. I had nothing left but hate. And hate don't fade easy." The cowboy lowered his rifle slightly. "I didn't ruin you, Dyer. You did that yourself." "You don't get to preach," Dyer spat. "You think blindness makes you innocent? You think the world forgave you just because it pitied you? I don't need forgiveness," the cowboy said quietly. "I just need peace." The silence that followed was unbearable. The woman's heart pounded as both men stood facing each other, one guided by rage, the other by resolve. The rising sun began to paint the horizon in faint gold, and the long shadows of the two men stretched across the ground, crossing like marks carved by fate. Dyer raised his revolver. "Then find your peace in the dirt." The shot split the morning air, but it wasn't the cowboy who fell. The woman had fired first. The echo rolled over the plains like thunder, then faded into silence. Dyer stumbled, clutching his chest, disbelief written across his face. He dropped his revolver, fell to his knees, and looked up at the cowboy with eyes filled not with hatred, but with something closer to confusion, as if the weight of all his years of vengeance had finally slipped off his shoulders, leaving him hollow. The cowboy stepped forward slowly, the rifle still in his hands. He could hear Dyer's labored breaths, the sound fading like a storm moving out to sea. "It didn't have to be this way," he said softly. Dyer tried to speak, but no words came. His hand fell against the dust, his gaze fixed on the open sky. And then he was still. The woman lowered her gun, her hands trembling so badly she could hardly breathe. She hadn't meant to kill him. She only wanted to stop him. The cowboy found her hand, his touch steady despite the tremor in his own voice. "You did what had to be done," he said quietly. Tears burned her eyes. "I never wanted it to end like this." He turned his face toward the wind. "Things on this land rarely end the way we want them to." They buried Dyer near the edge of the ridge that overlooked the valley. The earth was dry, stubborn, and it took nearly the whole morning to dig through. When they finished, the woman placed a small wooden cross above the grave. "He wasn't all bad once," the cowboy said, his voice distant. "He just forgot who he was." She looked at him, her heart heavy. "And you?" "I've been forgetting for years," he said. "But maybe now I can start remembering." Over the next days, the ranch slowly came back to life. The burned barn was cleared, the horses settled, and the long, hard quiet that had haunted the place began to lift. The woman stayed, not out of pity, but because something bound her to that land. And to the man who'd taught her courage, she never knew she had. She worked beside him each morning, planting, mending, rebuilding. He'd listen for her laughter when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Sometimes she'd catch him smiling faintly. A small miracle for a man who'd once forgotten how. One evening, as the sky turned red and the wind swept softly across the grass, he sat on the porch, carving a small wooden piece in his hand. She brought him coffee and sat beside him, her hair catching the last of the light. "What are you making?" she asked. He turned the carving toward her. It was a horse, rough but careful, shaped entirely by touch. "It's for you," he said, "for helping me find my way again." She looked down at the carving, her throat tightening. "You taught me just as much," she whispered. "Before I came here, I didn't know how to live on my own. I didn't know I could." He tilted his head toward her, smiling faintly. "The land teaches us both. It doesn't care who we were before, only who we are when we stand back up." For a while, neither spoke. The sound of the windmill turning slowly filled the silence, the steady creak like the heartbeat of the ranch itself. The pain of the past hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled them. It had become part of the soil, part of the wind, part of the story that the valley would carry long after they were gone. Later that night, after the stars filled the sky, she stepped outside again and found him standing by the fence listening to the night. The moonlight touched his face, softening the lines of weariness that had marked him for so long. "What do you hear?" she asked gently. He smiled faintly. "Life," he said. "The wind, the horses, the quiet. It used to sound like loneliness. Now it sounds like home." She stood beside him, their shoulders brushing, both of them looking out toward the open land. It was the same country that had nearly broken them, the same wind that had carried fear and fire. And yet, standing there together, it felt different. The emptiness no longer frightened her. The silence no longer hurt him. When dawn came again, golden light spilled across the fields, touching everything with warmth. The woman turned to the man beside her, the blind cowboy who had once been lost in darkness, and saw something new in him. Not the weight of what he'd lost, but the quiet strength of what he'd found. He reached out his hand, and she took it without hesitation. "There's still work to do," he said. She smiled. "Then we'd better start early." And as the two of them walked back toward the house, the land stretched wide before them, wild and endless, but no longer cruel. The valley that had once been a place of ghosts now breathed with life again. The wind carried away the last traces of smoke, the last echoes of gunfire, and left behind only peace. In that silence, their story settled into the earth, not a tale of revenge or survival, but of two people who learned that even the loneliest hearts could find home again, under the same old sky.